I would say I've interviewed, I think, every political leader in Israel from right to left, pretty much. And I have to say, I don't think there's any of them that wouldn't have responded similarly to the 7th of October, to the way he has.
Hey guys, it's Dovid Konikov, and I want you to watch the following clip of Douglas Murray discussing Benjamin Netanyahu. He discusses whether or not he is the right leader for Israel, as well as is he evil. He's on the Lex Friedman podcast. Check it out.
Can we talk about Benjamin Netanyahu? For a lot of people who spoke of evil, they refer to him as evil. On the spectrum between good and evil, as a leader, where does Netanyahu fall?
Well, he's certainly not evil. Interesting if people looking at this conflict were to be reluctant to use the word evil of Hamas and eager to use it of the Israeli prime minister. It would be sort of telling, I would say.
Can we just actually linger on that point? There's a point you've made multiple times, which is we're more eager to criticize and maybe even over-exaggerate the criticism of democratically elected leaders.
Yes.
It's a dark, weird, other quality of discourse at parties, aforementioned parties.
Isn't it also, I mean, not to be flippant for a moment, it's a little bit like, who do you show your worst sides to? The people you love. It's like, my intense irritability is something that tends to be felt most by people who are closest to me, because I'm if I express it to absolutely everybody I met at a party or a social setting, it would be hard. I mean, there's a tendency to lean heavily on the people who are closest to you, the people who will put up with it. And something similar happens in international politics. You pressure the people who will listen. I mean, it's one of the things you hear a lot in the last years. People sort of ignoramuses in the governments in places like Britain, will say we need to put more pressure on the Israelis to do X. And you go, well, in part that's because they will listen. If you go, we need to put more pressure on the Ayatollahs in Iran to persuade them that Hamas are really bad and they shouldn't be doing this. Right? What the hell do you think they're going to do? They're going to listen to you? They're going to give a damn? You're talking totally different worlds. Not just a different language, it's a different world. And by the way, that happens in Israel. I mentioned it earlier, but it happens in Israel. When the Hostage Families Forum came about, I spent a lot of time there, got to know a lot of the families, and they're remarkable. But one of the things you did notice from them as well was that a lot of them, they protest outside Netanyahu's house. They use klaxon horns to make sure he can never sleep. They will, put up great big posters by his house of him with bloodied hands and so on. And I have, I think as much sympathy as you can for these families. The plight of knowing that your child is sitting in a tunnel in Gaza for a year, a day, an hour is intolerable. But there's a reason why the families protested Netanyahu, and that's because Sinwar didn't care. That wouldn't work. If you said, understand my plight, I'm a Jewish mother and my daughter is thing. You think Sinwar, the heads of Hamas, care? You think the leaders in Qatar who host them care? The Qatari emir's mother, when Sinwar was killed, praised Sinwar. You couldn't talk that language to these people, but you can talk that language to the elected Prime Minister of Israel. Because that, first of all, he's somebody who might listen to your pressure, could be pressured. And secondly, is simply the only person you can pressure. There's no one else. Hamas doesn't care. Hezbollah doesn't care. The Iranian Revolutionary Government doesn't care.
Yeah, so let's just sort of say once again the obvious thing that while it is possible to discuss Hamas soldiers as freedom fighters. I'm not one of the folks that can take that perspective. It's a tough one to take.
I don't see how you can call them freedom fighters.
So this goes to the man from the land of peace and the man from the land of war. There is a lived experience of what it means to grow up in Gaza. And if you fully load that into your brain in a real way, not using the words of good and evil, but in a very deep human sense, from that place of desperation, when you're home and your family's destroyed, doesn't matter why, doesn't matter if there's evil all around you that caused it, doesn't matter. The facts are the facts. And from that place, somebody who's fighting for you can feel like a freedom fighter. I think it should be called out that, yes, it can feel that way from the lived experience, but Hamas is very clearly, since we're talking about Netanyahu, Hamas is evil. Okay. Now, you can still, in that context, discuss the degree to which Netanyahu is the right leader for this moment and whether he goes too far, whether he's too politically selfish in the decisions he makes, whether he's too much a warmonger, whether he's utilizing the war for his own political gains and is not caring about the death of civilians in Gaza, for example, but more caring about his own political maintaining power. That's a perspective that I could steal, man. And that's a perspective worth discussing. And that's a perspective many in Israel hold when they criticize Netanyahu. He's increasingly less and less popular.
That's wrong. Opinion polls last month when he was in Washington showed him at an all-time high.
You know,
but you were saying
I make my own poll, and according to my poll, I'm the greatest, I'm the nicest and the coolest person in the world. 100% of people agree.
So I didn't mean to laugh that much.
Yeah. You laughed a little too much.
Too long.
It's more than the joke. Yeah.
But you were saying, I mean,
yeah. Okay, let's steelman the criticism of Netanyahu. Can you, and then steelman the case for him that he's the right leader, actually, at this moment.
The most devastating thing that anyone could come up against Netanyahu is that the 7th happened on his watch. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Golda Meir, who was a very distinguished Prime Minister of Israel and a remarkable woman, but she effectively took the political hit for the Yom Kippur invasion by Israel's Arab neighbors happening on her watch. And I would have thought that most critics, fair-minded critics of Netanyahu inside Israel and without, would always hold that against him. I suppose that one of the criticisms you hear a lot as well is this thing of Israel being divided in the year before the 7th because of the judicial reforms. I think there's a strong case for judicial reforms in Israel, but it's a sort of niche Israeli governance issue, which we don't have to get into. The point is that Netanyahu and his government were pushing these reforms through, judicial reforms, and it was very divisive. And on the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities every weekend, there were protests, and the police were tired because they'd spent week after week on overtime policing these protests, which often turned raucous, not to say violent, or sometimes violent. And you could say, well, if you see that something is dividing your country this much, mightn't you stop? There is a claim by some people that one of the things that prompted the 7th was that Hamas and its backers in Qatar and Iran saw the division in Israeli society, saw the Israeli population, a significant chunk of it every week on the streets, shutting down highways, shutting down services and so on, and thought, good, now's the time. In other words, what I quoted Sinwar as saying earlier when he was in prison in Israel was, this thing, one day you'll be weak and then I'll strike. Maybe that is one of the things that Sinwar thought. Israel was very weak. It had been divided, and therefore the time to strike. There's an argument against that, which is that the 7th was in preparation and being planned before the judicial reform process in Israel began. So You can look at it several ways. But you could use that. You could say, look, this is, if your nation was divided, don't push through any more on that. There's lots of things like that. You could say that Netanyahu was one of the people responsible for the conception. You could. There are critics of his, including critics who were in the war cabinet, who thought that he was too focused on Hamas and not focused enough on Hezbollah. Other people think he was too focused on Hezbollah and not enough on Hamas. So there's them and many other criticisms that people make of him. I would say I've interviewed, I think, every political leader in Israel from right to left, pretty much. And I have to say, I don't think there's any of them that wouldn't have responded similarly to the 7th of October, to the way he has.
Okay, so that's inside Israel. Outside of Israel, despite what he said, he is one of the most hated people in the world. Just the raw quantity. Not relative, he's loved by a lot of people, but there's a lot of people that, there's a lot of psychological effects that might explain that.
I mean, it's sort of strange if there is a widespread global loathing of the prime minister of a country of 8 to 9 million people.
Yeah, that might mean something more than a hatred of the military actions and the policies of the one person. Yeah,
I mean, there's an awful lot of people to hate in the world. There's a lot of wars in the world. It's always of interest to me, and obviously some of the one things I go into on democracies and death cults is this question of like, why is this so galvanizing for so many people? And I think that is a very, very interesting question. Like, why? By the way, let me do a quick addendum to that. You can notice something else like that when people talk about the Republican failures in foreign policy in the last 30 years or so. It's very interesting. There's a certain type of person who will immediately mention Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah.
And they will say, well, Wolfowitz. And you go, you mean Deputy Undersecretary of Defense under George W. Bush? You think he guided everything? Why would that be? Other than the fact that his name, as Mark Stein once said, starts with a nasty animal and ends Jewish. I mean,
that's a good
so
line.
I do think that there are very deep things at play.
It's a good line.
There are very deep things at play. Netanyahu, irrespective of anything he does, for a lot of people, is a kind of devil. And you have to say, well, why is that? Now, of course, some people will say, well, that's because his terrible hawkishness and his actions and so on and so forth. The case for Netanyahu is that he sees it as his historic purpose to defend the only homeland of the Jewish people, and that's his life's mission. And on that basis, I think he's been, by any measure, a historic leader. He has warned the world about the threat from the mullahs in Tehran. He warned about Iranian revolutionary expansionism across the region, across Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. And after the 7th, he has held together a very, very difficult set of challenges to keep international pressure at a tolerable level, to do all sorts of things, but most importantly, to oversee the 2 war aims that he set out at the beginning. I thought, let me just express this way, I thought, like a lot of people, when I heard about the hostages, my immediate instinct was they're all dead. They're all going to be dead. We'll never see them again. And that was the attitude of a lot of Israelis. But although there are still hostages being held, and as I've always said, the war could end tomorrow if they were handed back, or at least the beginning of the end of the war could begin tomorrow if they were handed back. Nevertheless, because of the actions of not just Netanyahu, but the Israeli government, most of the hostages have been returned. Did not expect this to happen. And Hamas has not been completely destroyed, but it has been very, very significantly degraded. And you end up in the definition of what a total destruction of Hamas would look like. But they are not anywhere near the capability they were in November of 2023. Their leadership has almost all been killed. The second tier of leadership, almost all gone. And this is a just response to what Hamas did. The moment Netanyahu's reputation in Israel was at a low early on because of what had happened. But there's no doubt, and as I say in the final chapter of the book, there's General Slim had this phrase, from defeat into victory. Israel isn't at victory yet in this conflict, but when in September last year, there were a set of operational successes so extraordinary that, it was just like every day's news was. There was one day I remember when after the Assad regime fell, when the Israeli Air Force took out the entirety of the Syrian Air Force in a day because they didn't want it falling into the hands of the new jihadist administration in Syria. It was story number 4 on the BBC News website. The leadership of Hezbollah, gone. The second and third tiers of Hezbollah, gone or wounded. Iran's Rolls-Royce, destroyed. These are very, very significant military achievements, and are, in my mind, a just response to the attempts by Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Iranian proxies to destroy the Jewish state. Would another Israeli leader have been able to hold firm as Netanyahu has? I don't know. But I do know that any of them would have done something similar, or would have tried to do something similar, because there's no country on earth, no democracy on earth, which could possibly not respond to such an atrocity.
All right. I think that there's a lot of things to unpack there. Benjamin Netanyahu is a very mixed character. And what I mean by that is he has two sides to him. He has two sides that are against him. He has the left that hates him, and he has the right that hates him. I have a problem with Benjamin Netanyahu in the sense that I think he hasn't been hard enough on Hamas. He hasn't been hard enough on Israel's enemies. On the flip side, there are a lot of people that want Netanyahu to stop totally and have a problem with him in that way. I think it is 100% legitimate to think that Netanyahu endangered the lives of a lot of Israelis on October 7th. He hasn't really followed through in his promise to destroy Hamas yet. And he has been relatively soft with regard to feeding his own enemies, meaning sending in humanitarian aid, as well as allowing, Hamas to hide behind civilian casualties, and really prolonging this war is the main issue here. Doing different ceasefire deals that weren't good, releasing thousands of terrorists, etc. So there's a problem there, and I think that is totally legitimate. On the flip side, anybody that is criticizing Netanyahu for being too soft, I have zero respect for. I think that they are anti-Israel. They are completely delusional with regard to warfare, and they don't understand the level of evil that we're dealing with. And again, you can say that I'm being too harsh on Netanyahu because he's, maybe he does have a lot of pressure, and yeah, he is dealing with people calling arrest warrants for him every day, and he is dealing with this and that. But at the end of the day, this war could have been over in 2 to 3 weeks if they would have just done a siege or not given any food to Hamas. Think about the craziness of feeding your own enemies, and it really goes against common sense. And you can say, oh, it's American pressure. Well, American pressure is supposed to be deflected if they're wrong, meaning if Biden calls him up and says, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and if Z puts his own civilians in danger, puts his own soldiers in danger, Netanyahu has a responsibility to say, sorry, Biden, but no, this isn't going to happen. Sorry, Trump, but no, this isn't going to happen. And that's why I'll never criticize, U.S. presidents for taking a certain stance on Israel and Hamas and Gaza, because I understand that the U.S. is a sovereign state. Israel is supposed to be a sovereign state, and therefore it is Israel's responsibility to tell the U.S. no in the case that that is a sort of problem, and that Biden calls up Bibi or Trump calls up Netanyahu to do something that he otherwise wouldn't. For more, subscribe to the channel. If you want to help us make more of these videos, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/JewishUncensored and let me know your thoughts below on Bibi Netanyahu and whether he is a good or bad leader for Israel at this point. Thank you and have a good one.